Everyone, we're having a virtual class today. I had hoped to be able to be with you in person, but my dad is in the hospital and it is just really essential that I be at the with him tomorrow to make some important decisions. He had a stroke on Thursday night and we're just trying to do the best things for him. So I really appreciate your prayers and hope that this video will be helpful to us in keeping on track in our course. I also wanted to let you know that I'm working on grading your tests and I will have some feedback for you as soon as possible. All right, so effective uses of literature to teach social studies, and this is from the information in chapter 6. And just wanting to share with you that, you know, sometimes we use the phrase, you can't make this stuff up, right? Real life has its own mysteries and unbelievable things, and history is there. It's not like you have to go looking for the great things. And that's one reason why we say that you want your history lessons to be a story well told. Somebody was just sharing me with the other day, they were recalling some history lessons or classes that they took, and the two contrasts were, one, it just seemed like the facts were all poured out, and the second one, it was just like someone was telling me a story. And we want to, history is not a set of facts. I mean, there are facts related to it, right? But it is someone's life. It is a real event. And so we want to tell history as a story well told, and children's literature can help us do that. Some basic guidelines for selecting the literature that you will use. You should have a variety of reading levels because your students will represent a variety of reading levels, right? So think about your classroom library, think about the things that you read to students. Of course, if you're reading the book to the students, then the level can be above even what students can handle on their own. But you just need to consider that you have books available that represent different levels. And then let's also just continue on with that variety theme, okay? Topics and genres, not just the things that you like, you are the most interested in, but represent a nice variety. Genres, we mean like biographies, historical fiction, nonfiction, that type of thing, okay? Varying perspectives. So we want to make sure that we're hearing different voices in history, even missing voices, right? So that's why sometimes like it would be told from a child's perspective, or just from a voice that has been silenced in the past, something like that. Now be careful, we have a lot of junk history. A lot of people are trying to rewrite history. We're not suggesting that. We want to stick as closely to the real narrative as we can, but it does help to hear things from a different perspective, okay? And then sometimes we want to present a concept, or we want to teach a skill. So sometimes, like we might be using a book to teach about economics, and it might not really look like a social studies book, but it does help us teach a skill. So that is, you'll see some of those samples in our, I shouldn't say samples, but suggestions in your course textbook about, you think, wow, that's just a little picture book, how in the world? But it is the concept is what you're after. Also, just let me give you a couple, when we talk about like missing voices, sometimes a good fill in there is like a little known hero. For different views, I've already recommended Jean Fritz to you. She wrote a funny book about George Washington's mother, and that would give you a different perspective on him, okay? Sometimes different perspectives. This would be an example of the varying perspectives and using it to present concepts or teach skills. So maybe you're familiar with the book, The True Story About the Little Pigs. So telling the story from the wolf's perspective, okay? So you might use that book to help them understand that you can see like from different perspectives, even though it's just a fun Three Little Pigs story. I also own a book called Tops and Bottoms that teaches you a lot about cause and effect. So maybe you're just trying to help students understand, what do I mean by cause and effect? You could read the picture book Tops and Bottoms to help them learn that skill, even though it's not about history per se. Okay. All right. There are so many ways that you can do it. Okay. Are you going to read aloud to them? Make sure you practice ahead of time, right? You learn that in Children's Lit, but it is so important that you are ready to do a good job. It is also, by the way, best practice to read to your students every day. I have very good memories of reading the biography of Carl Schurz to my fourth graders. We were captivated. I can remember reading the biography of Adoniram Judson to my first graders. We were all ready to cry at certain points of the story. It has a very, draws your class together. But make sure that you choose wisely. So it's a book that has wide appeal to students and that reads well, okay? If you've ever listened to audiobooks, right? There are some books that are like very hard to listen to and other ones that you just can't put down. So be very careful with your selection there. You can have students listen to the answer for, like, tell them before you start reading, I'm going to read you something. I want you to find the answer. So this is a good just before reading activity anyway, whether you're reading to students or students are reading on their own, to give them a purpose for reading. Okay, so look for the answer to this. If you can bring in anything that's related, some kind of artifact, or visual props, even documents like the Bill of Rights or, mail for Pony Express, or just anything that, if you have any antiques or anything that would help to bring the story to life. We do talk a lot of times about using, a map too. So, and that can be whether it's an imaginary book or a real book, because I know I did an imaginary book with my fourth graders and we made a map of, it wasn't, geographically existent in the world, but it was in the book. And so making a map really helped us make sense of the story. So, you can have a lot of, like it talks about all these people and places. And if you can't picture where it's happening, a map can really help you sort that information out. So make sure that you do your best to make the use of literature engaging, is what we're saying. Increase comprehension and increase interest. Okay. How can students participate? Well, we already mentioned mapping the story, any kind of activity that ask them to apply what they're listening. Now, I would be careful. Sometimes you just say, well, I'm going to let my students color while they listen because it helps them. It might help some students. It might be distracting to others. So that's why we use that hands-on, minds-on. Basically, we're talking about doing some kind of activity. It could even be playing a game, could be an art activity, constructing a diagram, but just something to help them to bring the content to life, which might mean having them act it out. Maybe you want to have them rewrite the story with a different ending. There are different types. If you're not going to read to them, and we said you could have them read on their own, that would be independent reading. Maybe you want to all be reading the same text together, so the text is visible on the screen and you read some and they read some. That would be shared reading. Maybe some of you mentioned that you really like the idea of literature circles. So literature circles, students are, you have different choices. Students choose, it's kind of like a book club, which book club they want to be in. And again, remember that guideline of having books on different levels of reading, so that you have some easier and some harder, representing different genres, but all around the same theme. And then students work together. Those are usually student-led book clubs. Now you probably we're not going to go ahead and tell you exactly how to run a literature circle, but just letting you know that's an option. And if it's an option you choose, then you'll have to study out, like, how do literature circles work? Because there's definitely some organization tips that you're going to need to make it successful. All right, let's move on to the timing of the instruction. Because there's always the question, should you combine reading and social studies? And the answer is yes and no. Okay, I think that you can learn a lot of social studies during reading class. Usually when we're teaching students to read and teaching reading skills, we just have a different purpose. So we're teaching them comprehension strategies like visualizing or inferencing, asking questions. sequencing, and sometimes those work together with social studies and sometimes they don't. So I think it can work. I would just say to you that I would really hate to see that the only social studies instruction you have is during reading class. I think there's so much more that can be learned and having its own class period. One of the things your book suggested as well is that having social studies at the end of the day can be a detriment, because if students are too tired to focus, that's one thing. Although I will tell you, my students love social studies, and I think having it at the end of the day was okay because it was, we were pretty interactive. It was things they were interested in, and so it worked out for them. I would also caution you not to have like 2 listening classes. So for instance, a class like maybe a Bible class where the instruction is primarily oral, followed up by social studies where the presentation is primarily oral. I would say that's a bad combination because students are just not going to be able to focus with that much listening required. Okay, so you have to remember that young children have their attention span is shorter. So, about 25 minutes and we're done. So that might even be a long stretch for some, right? You're not going to do a 50-minute Bible lesson and a 50-minute social studies lesson. That's not going to fly. So put like maybe Bible, math, then social studies, or Bible, math, reading, then social studies. Mix it up so that the presentation mode is varied. That will help students too. There was the concern that putting social studies at the end of the day could mean that social studies would get crowded out. Very true. Okay. Of course, that could be true of any subject, right? So you have to, as a teacher, again, you have to be very intentional about your scheduling, and you have to make sure that it doesn't get crowded out every day. So you have to decide, where is it going to fit best in relation to the other subjects that you're teaching. But we're just suggesting that it often gets pushed to the edges and then proper attention is not given to it. Okay, so just be something to think about that, when is the timing of social studies going to be most effective? All right, let's just talk about a few more things related to literature. This book is a pretty interesting book. It's called Making Sense of History. You can see the title there and then the author, Myra Zarnowski, using high quality literature and hands-on experiences to build content knowledge. So I just have a few, going to extend the content in chapter 6 to include some of the things that Ms. Zarnowski wants to teach us from this book. And this is a book that you might consider adding to your personal library. So she brings out the idea of historical context. How can I help students understand the differences and similarities between the past and the present? After all, right, a lot of the people that you were studying lived in a very different time, okay? So build on the tension between the familiar and the unfamiliar. Okay. At the same time, show readers that the unfamiliar was appropriate and acceptable for its time. In other words, instead of portraying the unfamiliar as odd, backward, or, like, I can't even believe they did it that way, take the time to show it as fitting and reasonable. Context is very important. You can even, just to illustrate this, if you've ever gone back, if you've seen, pictures of your parents when they were teenagers, and you might have said to your mom, why did you wear your hair like that? Or I can't believe you wore those clothes, or, right? And maybe that was a very popular hairstyle, or clothing was, that's what everybody was wearing. Okay, but it looks funny to you, right? Context is everything. Okay. And just because it's not the way we did it does not mean it's wrong or bad. Okay. So keep that in mind and use literature as an opportunity for them to help them see that. Okay. So here are 2 books that do that. Okay. So the first one, if I'm going to go with the one on the right, this is about Lewis and Clark, and it's a Then and Now. And one of the things that's pointed out is that like today we get quick answers to our emails and phone calls. 200 years ago, the only way to communicate over distance was by mail carried by wagons or boat. Messages took weeks or even months to reach their destinations. I mean, it's amazing, right? How even sending a message across the world can go very quickly, right? Okay, so that it just helps us realize what it was like back, even just how long it took to get a message across. The Century Farm book, that's a Wisconsin farm built by his great-grandparents in the 1890s. And after the first frost, the grandpa cut the corn by hand and he stacked it in tall shocks. And it took 10 men and 10 teams of horses to haul that corn to the silo and chop it for winter cattle feed. Today, the farmer and his wife harvest the corn after the first frost. That's the same, but we chop it with a forage chopper pulled behind a tractor. And it says their equipment allows them to do the work of those 10 men and their teams of horses. Isn't that amazing, like how things have changed? Okay, so good books to just kind of show the contrast and help students think about that. Here's another book. So this is the Cowboys and the Longhorn book. If you look at that one, and one of the things that this book points out is that the cow hunt occurred at a time when the number of longhorns seemed limitless. There was little regard for the pain and suffering of animals. And totally different than how we might view it today. The cowboys weren't necessarily cruel, though, by the standards of their time. They didn't kill needlessly, but only what was required to secure stock. And you got to remember, these longhorns were not docile. This wasn't the rodeo where animals are outnumbered and overpowered. Okay, so before you jump to conclusions and condemn the cowboys, understand how difficult and dangerous their work was. This was 1866, not today. There were life-threatening, and the conditions were life-threatening and very unfamiliar. The Coast Mappers, okay, that was a survey of mapping the Pacific coast waterways in 1850, Pacific West, coast waterways in 1850. It helped the captains navigate in and out of the harbors. This was an extremely difficult task. And here's what you have to know. We have so much GPS today. That did not exist then. Okay, that was way back in 1850. Here's another book called Children of the Wild West. There is a lot of sensory detail in that book about traveling along the Oregon Trail in the 1840s. Here's a real short excerpt. It was a typical wagon train of the 1840s. The swaying wagons, plodding animals, and walking people stretched out along the trail for almost a mile. Near the end of the train, a boy holding a hickory stick moved slowly through the dust. He used the stick to pock and prod the cows that nudged behind him, mooing and complaining. "Get along," he shouted. "Hey, get going." Dust floated in the air. It clogged the boy's nose, parched his throat, and coated his face. His cheeks were smeared where he had brushed away the big mosquitoes that buzzed about everywhere. A lot of sensory detail to help students understand how different it was today. There's a book about Shakespeare. Although little is known about his early life, we can build a picture of what it was like in Stratford at this time. So here's some of the things that we know. We don't know everything for total sure, but if Shakespeare went to school, and that seems very likely, he probably went to King's New School in Stratford, starting at the age of 5. He would have gone 6 days a week, except for holy days like Easter and Christmas, every week of the year. 6 days a week, every week of the year. The school day was from 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening, beginning and ending with prayers. There was a 2-hour lunch break. Wow. 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening with a 2-hour lunch break. Wow. And you think the college day is long, right? Helps us understand the time period better. Okay, let's move to a different topic about historical significance. Okay, there are a lot of events in history, right? And we can't write about them all. We can't read about them all in our social studies class. We never get through them. History books are already pretty big, right? So this helps us kind of think about what are the most important ones to remember. So here are some books that will help you think about, like, how important was it to people at the time of the event? So books about fugitive slaves like Harriet Tubman, okay, were popular amongst 19th century readers. Then as now, they provided inspiring examples how human beings and their desire for liberty can overcome incredible difficulties. But the stories of the escaped slaves did more than that. They awakened thousands of readers to the evils of slavery, helping to bring on the struggle that freed more than 5 million people who hadn't been fortunate enough to escape. Okay, so how important was it to the people at the time? Here's another book, this Children of the Dust Bowl again, okay? And it's a question to ask is how many people were affected? The advertisements for workers led to what is called the Dust Bowl migration. It was the largest migration of people in US history. Between 1935 and 1940, over 1 million people left their homes in Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Missouri and moved to California. This event was not minor. Here's another book called Black Potatoes. How long-lasting were the effects? One effect of the famine was the bitterness and resentment it left behind. Another lasting effect was the scattering of the Irish people. By 1910, 5 million people had left Ireland for good. Today, Ireland's population numbers about 4 million, less than half of the amount in 1845. So how long-lasting were the effect? How important was it to the people at the time? How many people were affected? How long-lasting were the events? Okay, here's just a couple other considerations. When you talk about multiple perspectives, how can you help students understand that people in the past did not always see things the same way? I think that's true even today, right? Okay, you have to help people understand that there are gaps in information, errors that cause differences in accounts. Authors can actively contribute to distorting the past by exaggerating, giving into bias, and telling lies. That's one reason why I told you I like that Jean Fritz, because in the back, she puts like a lot of her research. Always have to remember, no matter what you're reading, that accounts reflect the author's viewpoint. He or she selects what to include, okay? So, and even any book that you read, right? That's one reason, if you look at the next bullet point about historical accounts, how can I show students that accounts are incomplete and require additional facts to tell the whole story? That's why we recommend that you use multiple sources, right? Okay. All right. We'll close with this slide. Historical truth helps students interpret historical fiction. So there's literal truth that can be verified. It's almost always highlighted in nonfiction, okay? This is facts, we know it, we can prove it. Our artistic truth, it can't be verified, but it seems true based on what we know about human nature. Even, you could say what we were saying about, like, we can't prove that Shakespeare went to school, but if he did, this is probably where he went and what it was like. And then there's historical trueness. It can't be verified, but likely to happen based on what we know. Okay, so just helping students understand the difference. It helps them. You want to contrast historical fiction with nonfiction, right? Historical fiction has got some historical trueness and artistic truth in it. Your nonfiction is going to be more of your literal truth, but we just have to be careful. We don't want to present like a historical trueness as literal truth. So we need to help students understand that, okay, and interpret it so that they can do it on their own. All right, I hope this was helpful in just thinking about using literature in your classroom, and we will continue on Wednesday. Thank you.